Hi everyone, I'm Shaylin here with Reedsy. So today I've got the second part in our series on short fiction. This is a deep dive into short stories, and I'm so excited about this series because short stories are probably my favorite thing to write. Today we're going to be talking about the actual drafting process. So in the first part of this series, we talked about conceptualizing a short story and all the different components of a short story. Character, plot, setting, structure, all of that stuff. Today we're talking about actually drafting. This will probably be the shortest part in the series because a lot of drafting is just going to depend on you. Kind of just got to sit down and write. Sorry to break it to you, the short of it is sit down and write your story. It might be difficult, it might be easy, and you'll have to just see where it goes. The more that you write short fiction, you'll find a method that works for you. You don't have to use one of the methods that I'm outlining in this video. You'll find your own method. But in this video, I'm just going to be giving you some different options of different ways that you could approach drafting a short story and some different things to consider depending on the method. The first short story that you write will probably be the hardest, and it'll probably take a couple before you start to really find your groove. For me, it was around the fourth story that I wrote that things really started to click and I felt more comfortable with the form. So if you're writing your first story or you're still new to it and it's really, really difficult, that's really normal. You're trying a new form and you kind of have to learn how to best approach it. Let's just talk about some different methods. The first method is outlining. So if you prefer to outline your novels, you can certainly do that with a short story as well. A short story probably only has between 1 and 10 scenes, making it fairly straightforward to outline. And the beauty of outlining a short story is that if you outline it in advance, it should be very quick to write. So what should you keep in mind when you're writing short fiction from an outline? First of all, you want to be mindful of your character's goals and motivations as you're making the outline and thinking about what they're going to do at each scene, as well as being mindful of any themes or ideas that you're exploring to make sure that your story is actually showcasing those themes and saying what you want to say about them. But also be aware of these things while writing. The writing process can reveal new things about a story, and it's very likely that once you start writing, new nuances to the characters or themes will emerge, so a change of plan may be required. Just be open to that. It'll be pretty easy to adjust your outline because a short story isn't very long. You want to make sure that every detail, line, and paragraph in your story contributes to your overall goal for the piece and nothing detracts from it. You don't want anything to be extraneous. So when you're making your outline, I assume you're probably going to plan out the scenes in your story, but not every single paragraph. So make sure when you're making your outline that all the scenes are necessary and you don't have any extraneous scenes, but then while you're writing each scene, be really mindful that every sentence is pulling its weight, every paragraph is pulling its weight. Keep in mind that anytime an object or an image is prevalent in a short story, it will naturally become a symbol, whether you really mean it to or not. Even if you don't know the meaning of that symbol, it's going to seem like one to a reader. You want to make sure that you're not putting too much importance on something that actually holds no relevance. You don't want to have extraneous things in your story that feel like they should mean something, but actually don't mean anything at all. That can really muddle the purpose of your story. Let's say you have a theme you're trying to explore, and then there are a bunch of random things that seem like symbols but aren't actually symbols. It'll be a lot harder for the reader to take away the theme that you're trying to convey because they think that all these things mean something related to the theme, but they actually don't. So be mindful of that. Method number 2 is the flashlight method. This is a method that people use to write novels, and you can also use it for a short story. The idea with the flashlight method is that you can walk down a long path with a flashlight. You can just see a little ways ahead of you, but you can still make it home the entire way, just seeing a few steps ahead. So if you like to discover your story as you write, identify your inciting incident and know your character's motivation, and then you can move forward scene by scene or even paragraph by paragraph based on what they would realistically do given their motivation. Just keep thinking a scene ahead, and you can make it the entire way through the story that way. Some things to keep in mind here. First of all, you want to be making those decisions based on what makes sense for your character's motivation and the themes or ideas in your story. Again, if you're trying to say something, whether about your character or whether about an idea, you want to make sure that the story is actually going that direction and actually saying that thing, rather than diverging from it or maybe saying something entirely different, you know? So let's say that your main character's goal is to steal their neighbor's pet chickens. This example inspired by my neighbor's very annoying chickens. So let's say you're writing this chicken stealing character, and you don't really know where the story is going to end up, but you know that they want to steal the chickens. You want to make sure that every scene is progressing the character towards their goal of trying to steal the chicken. Maybe they won't even succeed in stealing the chicken at the end. Maybe they won't even get the chance to steal the chicken. Who knows? But every scene further develops that goal rather than going astray from it. If you get stuck, take a step back and ask yourself, okay, what does my character want? What would they do to try and get closer to what they want? And then have them do that thing. You may have to go back and cut redundant scenes later. That's totally okay. But don't worry about this too much while drafting. Sometimes it's hard to know what's useful or not until you've written the whole story, and it's very easy to identify once you've written the story what's redundant. So if you have some redundant scenes, that's totally okay. You can go back and cut them later. This is usually the first thing I do when I finish a draft of a short story, is I just go back and cut the redundant scenes that I've now realized add nothing. Another really good thing to keep in mind here is to use the things that you've introduced into the story. If you introduce an idea, topic, or object or whatever into the story, try to bring it back in the end. So if we have this story about our chicken stealing character, let's say at the beginning it's also introduced that this main character has a garden gnome on their porch that they're very fond of. You want to bring that garden gnome back in the end and try to use it. Try to have it intersect with the chicken stealing somehow. Maybe they steal the chicken and then they break their garden gnome. And then they have to assess the cost of revenge. You've now written like a 4,000 word story about someone stealing your chicken that's about the morality and consequences of revenge. That's the beauty of short fiction. You can explore big ideas through small, mundane, or even somewhat ridiculous situations. But if that garden gnome was introduced in the beginning and it felt important, but it never came back into the story, we're gonna be asking ourselves, what was the point, right? We don't have much space in a short story. Paragraph describing a garden gnome that never comes back is going to feel redundant. What was that doing, right? Method number 3 is to write line by line. This is kind of like the flashlight method, except more intense. This is where you're literally gonna construct your story one line at a time, but you're going to do that really, really carefully. I had a writing professor who explained this method because it's the method that he used, and I've tried it before. It's pretty labor intensive, but it can lead to good results. The way that he described it is you write a line, and then you write whatever line feels necessitated by that line. So you're just writing line by line based on what feels necessitated by the previous line. Now, of course, sometimes you're gonna get on a roll and you're gonna kind of forget about that, or maybe you're gonna start doing that on a paragraph by paragraph basis, but this can be a good way to get started if you're starting from an opening image or an opening line, but you have no idea what comes afterwards. So here are some tips. If you get stuck, which you probably will with this method, you're gonna get stuck. I've tried writing with this method several times. It's led to really good results at times, but it's also caused me some headaches. You will get stuck. You have to push forward because the only way to keep uncovering the story is to write that next line. But sometimes if you get stuck, you have to look back. Look at what you've already written. It's very common with this method that you'll write things and you won't realize they're important until after you've written them. If you write a couple paragraphs and then you get stuck, go back and read those paragraphs. Really look at where the story is going, the ideas you've set up, the details you've set up, if there's anything extraneous that maybe is distracting you, and that can give you some insight on where you need to go. You have to be very observant with this method. You're basically observing your own writing as you're writing it because you don't know what you're doing. Sometimes you have to write a line and then ask yourself, why is this important? And if the answer is it's not important, then you probably don't need that line and you should cut it and write a different line. Sometimes if you get stuck, you also have to delete a few lines. You've taken the wrong path and now stalled yourself. So go back, find the fork in the road where you took the wrong path and start writing again. Personally, I've never used this method all the way through because at a certain point, you're probably, hopefully, going to gain some momentum. You'll realize where the story is going, what you're trying to do, and then you can write a bit more freely. This is a method that I do like to use a lot at the beginning of a story, especially if I have no idea where the story is going, if I'm just starting from a first line. Just write it line by line by line, but very intentionally. You have to be super intentional with this and really ask yourself what every line means. Usually after maybe a couple pages, you'll start to get a concept, a sense of a character, and you can write the story a bit more normally. Method number 4 is free writing. This is kind of like the more fun, free version of the previous method. So with the line by line method, we wrote one sentence at a time, very intentionally. What we're gonna do this time is start from that same opening. Let's say you have a starting idea for an image or a first line. Instead, what you're gonna do is basically use that as a prompt and free write. So rather than being super intentional, you're actually just gonna not care. Just let the story flow. Set a timer maybe and write a couple paragraphs, a couple pages. Then stop, read those pages or those paragraphs over and see what you're working with, and then maybe write the rest of the story more intentionally. So it's kind of like the line by line method. Rather than being super intentional to figure out what your story is doing, you're gonna just free write and see what emerges. Whatever that opening element that you have is, whether it's character, whether it's situation, whether it's an idea or a line, start from that one element and just follow it and see what emerges, and then at a certain point stop, read it over, and write the rest of your story. A few things to keep in mind here is that you will probably cut and rewrite a lot of stuff from your free write. That's to be expected. You're probably not going to keep everything from your free write. You're probably going to have to rejig and reshuffle it a lot. That's to be expected, and that's totally okay. Like with the previous method, you also have to be really observant with what you're writing. You might not stop to really pick it apart until after your free write, but you have to be really, really observant. You have to look for themes that are emerging. You have to look for character motivation. You have to ask yourself which details are important and need to be developed further, as well as looking for things that are extraneous or don't contribute and maybe should be edited out. But if there are things you don't like about your free write, I would change them early. If you write, let's say you do a little writing sprint and you write a page, but there's some stuff in there you don't like, edit it out now, because it's just going to distract you when you're going forward trying to construct the story with this random extraneous thing in there. So stop, look at your free write, maybe edit it, assess it, and then use that to write the rest of your piece. The last method I have to share with you is the endpoint method. This is where you don't outline your story, but you do know how the story ends. The structure of a short story is basically a connection of 2 points: the inciting incident and the climax, or what I call opportunity and revelation. You have an opportunity to explore an idea or a theme or a character, and then you actually say something about that idea or that theme or that character. If you know your story's beginning and end, you can write by just bridging them together, but figuring out how they're connected through writing. So let's say you have an inciting incident, you have a character with a goal and a motivation, and something you want to say about the character. Now it's just a matter of connecting A to B. This is like kind of half outlining. You know where you're going, but you don't necessarily know the route. Some stuff to keep in mind here, first of all, is to use every scene with purpose. This is a recurring theme, but you have to be really intentional and really purposeful in short fiction. You have to try to get the most out of every single scene and make sure that that scene is making a really meaningful step towards your conclusion. And like with the other methods, you really want to focus on your character's goal and motivation. You know where they're trying to get, and the thing that's going to bridge point A and point B is your character's goal and motivation, right? That's what's fueling the story. That's your source of conflict, right? So follow that. You also want to try to get to the end the quickest way possible. This is a recurring theme that I've mentioned before, but really the goal of short fiction is get to the end and say what you want to say with the fewest scenes possible. So really focus on that efficiency. And finally, only use flashbacks when they feel like a necessary part of the story. Really, this goes for any method. Sometimes we, as short fiction writers, can end up writing a flashback because we don't know what happens next. And the flashback is just there because as the writer, we don't know the next thing that's supposed to happen, and so we just add a flashback, but the flashback doesn't contribute anything. So really only reach for a flashback when it feels like the necessary next step. Let's say you write a scene and you realize, okay, this scene needs to be supported by backstory. Then it's a great time to add a flashback. But if the flashback is just there for you to kind of take your time to figure out the story, maybe you want to write it, but you probably want to cut it later. So let's just kind of synthesize that into some general stuff to keep in mind. No matter what your method, you want to keep in mind that everything should contribute to the purpose of the story, right? You don't want details that are introduced and then don't contribute anything. If you have one of those details that's introduced but then doesn't contribute anything, either cut it or ask yourself how it could actually contribute to the story, and maybe you want to tie it in. The next tip is to keep your timeline as short and clear as possible. In general, with short fiction, it will be easier to write and easier to follow if the timeline is as condensed as possible. If your story takes place over 5 months, but it could take place over 1 day, then I would just have it take place over 1 day. Or maybe it could take place over 1 week, then I would have it take place over 1 week. The longer your timeline, the easier it is for it to get confusing, and you can start to lose tension if there's too much space between the events, because they don't feel as tightly connected. You want to start your story as close to the inciting incident as possible. Aim to have your inciting incident in the first paragraph. It can be the first sentence. Have it, at least in the first scene, but especially if you're writing a shorter piece, really try to have it like on that first page, first paragraph, even the first sentence is great. And same thing with the end. Short stories don't usually have any kind of falling action. As soon as the story's climax is over, the story ends. We don't really get falling action, you know, like end the story as soon as the story ends. Once you've said what it is you wanted to say, it's time to end the story. And finally, in most cases, you probably want to minimize your cast. You know, we can't all be Alice Munro. She's famous for having super large casts of characters, but it is exceptionally difficult to write stories with giant casts. It can definitely be something you can work up to, but the thing is, most stories don't need a lot of characters. Most stories are best with only, 2 or 3 characters, maybe 4. More than that, and it starts to be a lot to juggle. When in doubt, 2 characters can be all that you need, right? So minimize your cast. The more characters you have, naturally the longer the story will be, because you have to introduce and explore more personalities on the page, and they can lead to kind of a lot of side tangents that maybe don't contribute. So only have the necessary characters. Next week, we're going to be talking about editing your short story. So once you've drafted it, now you gotta take that and clean it up and make it nice and shiny and polished. A lot of the time, editing is really where the magic happens in short fiction, because once you've written a story and you've got all the pieces in front of you, now it's time to really make them all fit together. And of course, if you want to watch the rest of this series, as it's posted, it'll be added to a playlist that I will leave linked in the cards and in the description. Thank you so much for watching. Remember to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss any new videos from us. We post new writing, editing, and publishing content every week on this channel. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.